started out as an innocent adventure, a group of friends yearning to escape the monotony of their everyday lives. Jenna, Eric, Mia, and Tom had been inseparable since college, their bond forged through late-night study sessions and shared dreams of exploring the unexplained. Berkeley, a forgotten town with a haunting reputation, had recently resurfaced on urban legend blogs. Supposedly, it was abandoned after a string of mysterious disappearances in the 1950s. Now the town was whispered about in online forums as a hotspot for paranormal activity. Tom, ever the thrill seeker, was the one who suggested the trip. "Think about it," he'd said, grinning. "We can be the first to uncover the truth about Berkeley, maybe even make a documentary. People eat this stuff up online." Mia had been hesitant from the start, the faintest edge of anxiety in her voice. "Why does it have to be Berkeley? That place doesn't just have ghost stories. It has warnings. People say no one comes back the same." Jenna and Eric had laughed it off. "It's just a weekend, Mia," Jenna had said. "A bit of fun. Besides, it's not like ghosts are real." Now, as they drove through the thickening woods, Mia's unease had started to infect the group. The GPS had lost signal miles back, and the once clear sky was now shrouded in low-hanging clouds. The road narrowed to little more than a cracked, uneven path, barely wide enough for their car. The forest seemed alive, the trees leaning closer as though they were listening. Eric broke the silence. "This is ridiculous. There's no way this is a real road. Are we even sure Berkeley exists?" Tom, sitting in the passenger seat, pointed ahead. "There! That's gotta be it!" The group fell silent as the car crested a hill, revealing the ghostly outline of Berkeley below. The town sat in a shallow valley, shrouded in mist that seemed unnaturally thick. Its buildings were skeletal and crumbling, their outlines jagged against the dim light of the overcast sky. A single spire, what looked like an old church, rose from the center of the town like a lone sentinel. "Wow," Jenna breathed. Her voice hushed. Tom raised his camera, already recording. "This is going to be incredible." But as they descended into the town, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew colder, biting even through their jackets. The mist thickened, curling around their car like grasping fingers. By the time they reached the edge of Berkeley, the silence was deafening. Eric parked the car near what looked like an old general store. Its sign hung crooked, the paint long since faded. The group climbed out, their footsteps crunching against the gravel road. "This place is unsettling," Mia whispered, looking around. "That's the point," Tom said, adjusting the strap of his camera. The group walked through the empty streets, the sound of their footsteps echoing like gunshots. Every building seemed frozen in decay, windows shattered, doors hanging open. A faint wind whistled through the cracks, carrying the faintest hint of something metallic. Blood, Jenna thought, though she didn't say it aloud. It was Mia who saw the figure first. "Wait, do you see that?" They all turned. At the far end of the street stood a woman, her back to them. She wore a tattered dress that swayed gently, though the air was still. Her posture was unnaturally rigid, her head tilted slightly to one side as if listening. Tom waved. "Hey, are you from around here?" The woman didn't respond. "Let's just leave her alone," Mia said, taking a step back. But Tom was already walking toward her. The others followed reluctantly, their unease growing with every step. When they were about 10 feet away, the woman moved, but not like a person should. Her body slid sideways, her feet never lifting from the ground. She disappeared between two buildings, the mist swallowing her whole. "What the hell was that?" Eric muttered. "Maybe it was just some kind of trick," Jenna offered weakly. "Or maybe it was a ghost," Mia said, her voice trembling. Tom lowered his camera, his brow furrowed. "I don't know, but we've got it on film. Let's keep going." The group explored for another hour, though the air grew heavier with every passing minute. They found no more signs of life, but strange things began to happen. Jenna thought she saw movement in the windows of the old church, but when she turned to look, the glass was empty. Eric swore he heard footsteps behind them, but when they stopped to listen, the sound vanished. By the time the sun began to set, the group decided to find shelter. The inn, though decrepit, was the only building that looked remotely intact. Its sign, Berkeley Arms, swung on rusty chains, the squeal of metal unnervingly loud in the stillness. Inside, the air was damp and stale, carrying the faint scent of mildew and something sweet, something rotten. "Let's just stay here for the night," Eric said. "We'll leave first thing in the morning." Their room was sparse, a single dusty bed and a cracked mirror hanging on the wall. A window overlooked the main street, though the mist was so thick now they could see nothing beyond it. As Jenna unpacked her bag, she noticed the first handprint. It was faint, pressed against the glass, and too small to belong to any of them. "Guys, look!" The group crowded around the window, their unease growing. Tom tried to laugh it off. "It's just old, probably been there for decades." But when Jenna checked again an hour later, the handprint had moved. The terror escalates. That night, the tapping began. It was faint at first, like the sound of fingernails drumming against wood. But it grew louder, more insistent. It came from the walls, the ceiling, the floor, impossible places. And then, the voice. Soft, almost melodic, it whispered, "Don't touch. Don't let them touch." Jenna felt it first, a cold hand brushing against her cheek. She screamed, waking the others. "I felt it," she cried. "Something touched me." The group huddled together, their terror mounting as the whispers grew louder. Shadows flickered at the edges of the room, shapes that shouldn't have been there. And then the door creaked open. Tom was the first to run, bolting into the hallway. The others followed, but the inn was no longer the same. Its hallways twisted endlessly, and every door led back to the same room. And then they saw the figures, pale, featureless, their hands outstretched. "Don't let them touch you!" Jenna screamed, her mind racing. But it was too late. One by one, the hands found them, cold and unrelenting. When Jenna woke, she was alone in the car. The town was gone, replaced by an empty field. She glanced at the rearview mirror, her breath catching in her throat. There on the backseat window was a single pale handprint. It began with a road trip, a perfect plan for an autumn getaway. Just 4 friends, an open highway, and endless possibilities. Emily was the planner, meticulous about routes and stops. Jake, her boyfriend, was the driver with a knack for navigating unfamiliar roads. Karen, the comedian of the group, kept everyone laughing, while Sam, quiet and thoughtful, was the voice of reason. The destination was a remote cabin Emily had found online, nestled deep in the woods. The reviews promised tranquility, scenic views, and absolute seclusion. "No cell service," Emily had warned, waving her phone in the air. "It's going to be a digital detox." Jake had grinned at that. "We'll see how long Karen lasts without TikTok." Karen had rolled her eyes. "I'll manage as long as someone else cooks." Sam chuckled, but didn't join the banter. He wasn't sure why, but he had felt uneasy about the trip ever since Emily had first suggested it. He chalked it up to being overworked lately. A break was what he needed. As they loaded the car and started the drive, excitement filled the air. They had no idea what was waiting for them. It was nearing sunset when Jake missed the turn. "This road doesn't look right," Sam murmured from the back seat, staring out the window as the car rattled over the uneven path. Emily frowned at the map in her lap. "It's not the route I marked, but if we keep going straight, it should loop back to the main road." "Relax," Jake said, his confidence unfaltering. "The GPS says we're fine." Karen glanced at her phone. "The GPS stopped working an hour ago, genius. There's no signal." The mood shifted as the trees seemed to close in around them, the branches casting long shadows across the car. The dense woods grew darker with each passing moment, and the laughter from earlier faded into uneasy silence. "Maybe we should turn around," Emily suggested, her voice quiet. "No way. We'll waste too much time," Jake said, gripping the steering wheel. "This road has to lead somewhere." But even Jake couldn't hide his apprehension as the path narrowed, the car bumping over rocks and roots. And then, just ahead, they saw it. The figure was lying in the middle of the road, face down, arms splayed out like a broken doll. "Stop the car!" Karen screamed, clutching the seat in front of her. Jake slammed the brakes, the car skidding to a halt just a few feet from the body. For a moment, no one moved. Is he dead?" Emily whispered, staring at the motionless figure. Sam leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. "We need to check." "Hold on," Jake said sharply. "What if it's a setup? You've heard those stories about fake accidents. They wait for someone to get out of the car and then rob them." Karen shook her head, her voice trembling. "Look at him, Jake. He's not moving. What if he's hurt? We can't just leave him here." Reluctantly, Jake put the car in park. "Fine, but I'm keeping the engine running." Sam and Jake got out, the cool evening air biting against their skin. As they approached the man, the forest seemed unnaturally quiet. No rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, just silence. "Sir," Sam called out, kneeling beside the body. He hesitated, then reached out to touch the man's shoulder. The moment his fingers brushed the torn fabric, the body jerked violently. Sam yelped, stumbling back onto the gravel. The man twisted his head to look at them. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, filled with an emotion Sam couldn't quite place, fear or rage. His lips parted and he croaked, "Help me." Jake and Sam exchanged a nervous glance. "What happened to you?" Jake asked, his voice steady but cautious. The man struggled to sit up, clutching his side. His clothes were torn, and his skin was unnaturally pale, almost translucent. "Accident," he rasped, his voice weak and broken. "My car! Over there!" He pointed into the woods. Jake followed his gaze but saw nothing beyond the shadowy trees. "Where? I don't see anything." Sam crouched beside the man again. "We should call for help." "There's no signal," Jake reminded him. "Then we take him with us," Karen called from the car, leaning out the window. "He needs a hospital." The man's head snapped toward her voice. "No!" he shouted, startling them all. His voice cracked with desperation. "Don't touch me. Don't let them touch you." Before anyone could ask what he meant, the man collapsed again, his body limp. Against the man's cryptic warning, they carried him into the car. His body was cold, unnaturally so, and his skin felt strange, rubbery and slightly damp. Karen recoiled when her hand brushed his arm. "He feels wrong," she muttered under her breath. As they drove, the man stirred occasionally, mumbling incoherent fragments of sentences. "They're coming. Always watching. Don't let them touch you." "What is he talking about?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "No idea," Jake muttered, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Sam sat silently staring at his hand, the same hand that had touched the man first. He felt a faint burning sensation crawling up his fingers, but he didn't say anything. When they finally reached the cabin, it was almost fully dark. The structure loomed ahead, its wooden frame barely visible through the thickening mist. Emily unlocked the door, and they carried the man inside, laying him on the couch. "Let's just get him through the night," Sam suggested. "We'll figure out what to do in the morning." Emily nodded, rummaging through the first aid kit, but the man's wounds didn't make sense. There were no cuts, no bruises, just strange, dark patches on his skin that seemed to pulse faintly under the dim light. "What is this?" Emily whispered, her hands trembling. As night fell, an oppressive weight seemed to settle over the cabin. The air felt heavy, and the temperature dropped sharply. The man's breathing grew shallow, his chest rising and falling in uneven jerks. And then, just after midnight, he sat bolt upright. "They're here," he whispered. The sound came first, a faint rustling outside like footsteps crunching over leaves. It grew louder, circling the cabin. "What is that?" Karen whispered, her voice shaking. "They followed me," the man rasped, his eyes wide with terror. "They always follow the touch." Sam froze. What do you mean, the touch? The man turned to him, his gaze piercing. Did you touch me? Sam hesitated, his stomach sinking. Yes, I helped you. The man's face twisted in despair. Then it's too late. They'll come for you first. Before anyone could ask what he meant, the front door creaked open. The cabin plunged into chaos. Shadows flickered across the walls, long twisted shapes that didn't match any human figure. The whispers began, soft and unintelligible at first, but growing louder, more insistent. Karen screamed as something cold brushed against her arm. Jake swung the flashlight toward her, but the beam revealed nothing. They're inside, the man croaked, his voice barely audible over the whispers. One by one, they disappeared. Karen's screams cut off abruptly as the shadows swallowed her whole. Jake fought against the unseen force, but he too was dragged into the darkness. Emily clung to Sam, her nails digging into his arm. What do we do? She whispered, tears streaming down her face. But Sam couldn't answer. His arm burned where he had touched the man, the sensation spreading like ice through his veins. The whispers grew louder, a single word repeated over and over. Ours. Sam looked down at his arm. The skin was no longer his. It was gray, rubbery, inhuman. The last thing he saw before the shadows consumed him was a pale hand reaching out, brushing his cheek in a mockery of comfort. When the search party found the cabin days later, it was empty. No signs of struggle, no bodies, just a single handprint burned into the floor, a reminder of the dangers of human touch. The rain fell in relentless sheets against the windshield, blurring the headlights of passing cars and smearing the dark highway into a long, glistening stretch of desolation. Paul adjusted his grip on the steering wheel, his calloused fingers stiff from hours of driving. The CB radio crackled faintly, but no one was talking tonight. Too late, too wet, too lonely. Just him, his truck, and the open roads slicing through nowhere. Paul had been a truck driver for over 2 decades. He'd seen every kind of weather, every kind of road, and every kind of hitchhiker. But after the stories he'd heard, urban legends and real accounts of things that happened to drivers who picked up the wrong stranger, he rarely stopped for anyone. It wasn't worth the risk. Tonight, though, something felt different. He couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the weight of the rain, the oppressive way it blurred the world in muffled sound. Or maybe it was the gnawing guilt he carried from ignoring that woman last week, standing alone on the roadside with a cardboard sign in her hands. But when he spotted a lone figure standing under a flickering streetlight at the entrance of a rest stop, he felt compelled to pull over. The figure was slight, wrapped in a soaked jacket, a hood obscuring most of their face. They didn't wave or flag him down, just stood there, staring at the road as if waiting for someone or something. Paul rolled down the window and leaned out, rain splattering his face. "Need a ride?" he called, his voice gruff from hours of silence. The figure didn't answer immediately, but eventually nodded. They moved toward the truck with a slow, deliberate gait that Paul found unnerving. The way they climbed into the cab was equally strange. No hurry, no hesitation, as if they'd done this 1,000 times before. Once inside, the stranger pushed back the hood, revealing a pale, gaunt face. It was a young woman, no older than her mid-20s, with hollow cheeks and eyes that seemed to drink in the dim light of the dashboard. Her wet hair clung to her face like black vines. "Thanks," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the rain pounding the roof. Paul nodded, glancing at her out of the corner of his eye. "Where are you headed?" "Just up the road," she murmured. "I'll tell you where to stop." Her hands rested in her lap, fingers interlaced tightly. Paul noticed the raw redness of her knuckles, like she'd been gripping something too hard for too long. They drove in silence for several miles. Paul tried to shake the unease settling in his chest. It wasn't just the storm or the late hour. There was something off about her. She didn't fidget, didn't shift in her seat, or glance out the window like most hitchhikers did. She sat perfectly still, her gaze fixed straight ahead, as though she wasn't really seeing the road. "So," Paul said finally, trying to break the tension, "What were you doing out there in this weather?" "Waiting," she said simply. "For what?" Her head turned slowly to face him, and for the first time Paul saw her eyes clearly. They were dark, not just brown, but impossibly black, like twin voids that seemed to pull at the edges of his vision. A chill ran down his spine. "For you," she said. Paul's grip on the wheel tightened. He forced out a laugh, though it sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Well, you're lucky I came along then. Not many drivers stop at this hour." She didn't respond, just turned her head back toward the road. "Oh!" The truck rumbled on, the wipers squeaking rhythmically against the glass. Paul tried to focus on driving, but the air in the cab felt heavier with each passing mile. He found himself stealing glances at her, half expecting her to vanish or transform into something else. And then she touched him. It was a light, fleeting brush of her fingers against his arm, but it sent a jolt through his body like an electric shock. His vision blurred for a moment, and the truck swerved slightly before he regained control. "Hey!" he barked, his voice sharper than he intended. "Sorry," she said softly, pulling her hand back. But there was no apology in her expression, just that same unsettling stillness. Paul's skin tingled where her fingers had grazed him, the sensation spreading like ice through his veins. His mind raced. He couldn't stop thinking about her touch, how it had felt too cold, too unnatural, as though her skin wasn't made of flesh, but something else entirely. "I think this is far enough," she said suddenly, her voice cutting through his spiraling thoughts. Paul glanced around. They were in the middle of nowhere, the highway stretching endlessly in both directions. "Here! There's nothing out here. This is the place," she insisted, her tone firm now. Reluctantly, Paul pulled onto the shoulder and brought the truck to a stop. The woman reached for the door handle, but paused, turning to him one last time. "Thank you," she said, her lips curling into a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Be careful on the road." And then she was gone, stepping into the rain and disappearing into the darkness without a backward glance. Paul sat there for a long moment, his heart pounding. Something about the encounter felt unfinished, like an itch he couldn't scratch. Finally, he shook his head and pulled back onto the highway, eager to put distance between himself and whatever that had been. But the unease didn't leave him. Hours later, when he stopped at a truck stop to grab coffee and stretch his legs, he noticed something strange. His arm, where she had touched him, was bruised. Not just a small mark, but a deep, spreading discoloration that looked like fingerprints burned into his skin. Paul stared at it, his pulse quickening, and then he felt it, the cold, unmistakable sensation of a hand on his shoulder. He turned sharply, but no one was there. Over the following days, the bruises spread. They crept up his arm, across his chest, down his back, forming an intricate pattern of handprints that seemed to tighten around him like a vice. His nights were plagued by nightmares of shadowy figures reaching for him, their cold, skeletal fingers clawing at his flesh. And always he woke with the same sensation, the touch of a hand that wasn't there. By the time Paul realized what was happening, it was too late. The bruises weren't just marks, they were something more, something alive. He could feel them moving under his skin, tightening their grip with each passing day. He stopped driving, stopped leaving his house, but it didn't matter. The touch followed him everywhere, a constant chilling reminder of the woman on the road. And then, one night, it consumed him entirely. When they found Paul's truck weeks later, abandoned on the side of the highway, the cab was empty. But the seats, the dashboard, and even the steering wheel were covered in dark, hand-shaped imprints, as though dozens of people had pressed their palms into the surfaces with unnatural force. No one ever saw Paul again, but drivers on that stretch of highway still talk about the figure that appears under the flickering streetlight on rainy nights. A pale woman with hollow eyes, waiting for her next ride. It began on a quiet stretch of Route 17, somewhere between nowhere and anywhere. The open road stretched into the distance like a black ribbon, flanked by shadowy woods on either side. The sun had long set, and the only illumination came from the headlights of Nick and Kara's beat-up sedan as they cruised through the empty highway. This road trip was supposed to be an escape, a way to rekindle their fading sense of adventure after years of routine. Their plan was simple: no itinerary, no expectations, just drive, explore, and stop whenever something caught their attention. But as the hours dragged on, their lighthearted banter faded. Hunger clawed at their stomachs, and exhaustion pressed heavily on them both. The endless stretch of dark roads seemed to mock their lack of preparation. Nick glanced at the glowing numbers on the dashboard clock. 11:47 p.m. "Should we just pull over and sleep in the car?" he suggested. "I'm not sleeping on an empty stomach," Kara replied, rubbing her eyes. "We've got to find something soon, right?" Nick shrugged. It had been miles since they'd seen a single light, let alone a restaurant. Just when he was about to give up hope, Kara's voice broke the silence. "Wait, look!" Out of the darkness, a flickering neon sign emerged. Taco Haven, open late. Below the sign sat a rusty, weather-beaten taco truck parked at the edge of a gravel lot. A string of dim fairy lights hung from its awning, swaying lazily in the breeze. The lights gave off a faint, sickly yellow glow, barely cutting through the surrounding darkness. Nick frowned. "That's weird. A taco truck? Out here? Who cares? I'm starving," Kara said, already unbuckling her seatbelt. As they pulled into the lot, Nick hesitated. There were no other cars, no signs of life except the flickering lights. The gravel crunched under the tires, unnervingly loud in the stillness of the night. The smell hit them before they even stepped out of the car. It was intoxicating. The aroma of spiced meat, sizzling onions, and fresh tortillas wafted through the air, so rich and savory that it made Nick's mouth water despite his unease. "See? It's fine," Kara said, her voice bright with relief as she opened the car door. Nick hesitated for a moment longer, then followed her. The air was cool, the night unusually quiet except for the faint buzz of the neon sign overhead. The serving window of the truck was open, but there was no one behind it. A small bell sat on the counter next to a handwritten note. "Ring for service." "Doesn't this feel off to you?" Nick asked, his voice low. Kara shot him an annoyed look. "Not everything is a conspiracy, Nick. Just ring the bell." Reluctantly, he reached out and tapped the bell. The chime rang out, sharp and metallic, cutting through the night like a blade. A few moments later, a figure appeared in the serving window. The man, or at least they thought it was a man, was tall and thin, his face hidden beneath the shadows of a hood. His hands, pale and spidery, rested lightly on the counter. Something about him felt wrong. He moved too smoothly, like a puppet on invisible strings, his movements deliberate but unnatural. "What can I get you?" he asked, his voice low and rasping, as if it hadn't been used in years. Kara didn't seem to notice his strangeness. She stepped forward eagerly, ordering 2 tacos for herself and 2 for Nick. Nick, however, couldn't take his eyes off the man's hands. They were flawless, unnervingly so, skin pale and unblemished, fingers long and delicate, like they had never done a day's work. The man nodded silently and disappeared into the depths of the truck. The sounds of sizzling meat and chopping vegetables filled the air, but beneath those familiar noises was something else, a faint, wet squelching, like raw flesh being torn apart. Nick's unease deepened, but Kara was too focused on the promise of food to notice. Minutes later, the man returned, placing 2 foil-wrapped bundles on the counter. When Nick reached out to take them, the man's fingers brushed against his. It was like touching ice. A shiver ran up Nick's arm, the chill burrowing deep into his bones. He yanked his hand back instinctively, cradling it against his chest. "Thanks," Kara said, grabbing the tacos and heading back to the car. Nick followed her, glancing over his shoulder. The man was still standing there, watching them. His hooded face was obscured, but Nick swore he could feel those empty eyes boring into him. They ate in silence, parked under the dim glow of the truck's lights. The food was incredible, rich, flavorful, and almost too perfect. Every bite sent a surge of warmth and satisfaction through Nick's body. temporarily silencing his lingering doubts. But as the last bite disappeared, a strange sensation began to creep over him. His fingers tingled, the same icy chill from the man's touch spreading through his hands. Across from him, Kara's breathing grew labored. "Nick," she whispered, clutching her stomach. "I don't feel so good." Nick opened his mouth to respond, but his voice wouldn't come. His throat felt tight, his tongue heavy. A wave of nausea hit him like a freight train, doubling him over as he retched violently onto the gravel. The world around him blurred, the truck's neon lights spinning into a kaleidoscope of colors. Somewhere in the distance, he heard Kara scream. And then everything went black. Nick awoke to the sound of metal clanging. His head throbbed and his limbs felt like lead. When he tried to move, he realized he couldn't. Thick leather straps bound his wrists and ankles to a cold metal table. The room was dimly lit, shadows flickering on the walls. The smell of the tacos lingered in the air, now mingled with something else, something metallic and coppery. Panic surged through him as his eyes adjusted to the light. He was inside the taco truck. The man stood over him, his hood now discarded. His face, or what should have been his face, was a smooth, pale expanse of skin. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just emptiness. "You shouldn't have stopped," the man rasped, his voice echoing unnaturally. Nick's gaze darted to the counter beside him, where an array of knives and tools lay gleaming. His stomach twisted as realization set in. "Where's Kara?" he croaked, his voice barely audible. The man tilted his head as if amused. "She's part of the menu now." Nick's scream was cut short as the man placed a cold, skeletal hand on his chest. The icy touch spread through his body like wildfire, freezing him in place. He could feel it now. The truth, the meat, the tacos. And as the man picked up a gleaming blade, Nick realized he was about to become the next ingredient. By the time the next travelers stumbled upon the taco truck, it was as if nothing had happened. The neon sign buzzed faintly, its promise of late-night food drawing weary souls like moths to a flame. And behind the counter, a new face greeted them with a chillingly perfect smile. The old highway stretched endlessly ahead, a single strip of cracked asphalt winding through an ocean of trees. Claire adjusted her grip on the steering wheel, her knuckles pale in the dim light. She had been driving for hours, the hum of her car's engine steady, almost hypnotic. The map had promised a shortcut, a quicker route to cut down the 7-hour drive to her sister's cabin. It wasn't her first road trip alone, but this time felt different. The GPS had stopped working miles back, and her phone displayed the dreaded no signal in the corner. But Claire wasn't worried. Not yet. She had confidence in her sense of direction and had marked her destination clearly on the map. The shortcut was supposed to save her time, and she needed to save time. She wanted to make it to the cabin before nightfall. The day had begun bright and warm, with the golden glow of autumn leaves lining the roadside. But as the sun dipped lower in the sky, the atmosphere shifted. The brilliant orange hues of the forest grew darker, the trees leaning closer together like conspirators whispering secrets. The air turned cool and damp, and the once inviting road now seemed to twist unnaturally, its curves sharp and sudden. Claire glanced at her phone again. No bars. She sighed and turned up the radio to break the silence. Static. She fiddled with the dials, but no station came through. The hum of the engine and the tires on the pavement were her only company now. Her unease began to grow when she noticed something strange. The mile markers she had been casually tracking were no longer appearing. The last one she had seen was mile 14, and now it felt like miles had passed without another. The road signs had vanished too. No turnoffs, no speed limit signs. Just an endless stretch of black asphalt bordered by darkening trees. Claire shook her head, trying to push away the irrational thoughts creeping in. She told herself it was just an old road, poorly maintained, maybe even abandoned. But her instincts whispered otherwise. Then she saw it. At first, it was just a speck in the distance. She squinted at the figure standing at the edge of the road. As her car approached, her stomach twisted. A woman, motionless, her silhouette thin and gaunt. She wore a tattered gray dress that fluttered slightly in the breeze, and her head was bowed, her face obscured by long, unkempt hair. Claire's heart pounded. She wasn't the type to pick up strangers, especially not in the middle of nowhere. Yet something about the woman seemed off. Not threatening exactly, but unnatural, as though she didn't quite belong. Against her better judgment, Claire slowed the car and rolled down her window. "Do you need help?" she called out, her voice trembling. The woman didn't respond. She didn't even move. Her arms hung limply at her sides, her head still bowed. "Are you okay?" Claire tried again, leaning slightly out of the window. The woman raised her head slowly. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The woman's face was wrong, not disfigured, but unfamiliar, like a mask made by someone who had never seen a real human before. Her eyes were too large, too dark, and they seemed to pierce through Claire, as if they could see straight into her soul. Claire's instincts screamed at her to drive away, but she felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed by those unnatural eyes. Before Claire could react, the woman stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate, and placed a hand on the car's door. The touch was ice cold. Pain shot up Claire's arm, sharp and electric, as though she had been shocked. She yelped and jerked back, her heart racing. But when she blinked, the woman was gone. The road ahead was empty, the trees swaying gently in the wind. Claire's hands shook as she gripped the wheel. She laughed nervously, trying to convince herself that it was nothing. A hallucination, maybe. Stress or the tricks of the fading light. But when she glanced at her arm, her stomach dropped. Where the woman had touched her, Claire's skin had turned pale and translucent. Veins spread beneath the surface like delicate, branching rivers. The drive became unbearable after that. The forest seemed darker, the trees pressing closer. Her headlights barely penetrated the gloom, and the oppressive silence wrapped around her like a shroud. The pale patch on her arm itched now, but she was too afraid to touch it. Then came the sound, a faint rustling from the back seat. Claire's heart skipped a beat. She glanced in the rearview mirror, her breath catching. The back seat was empty, but the sound continued, a soft, rhythmic rasp, like fabric brushing against leather. She gripped the wheel tighter, her knuckles white. "Get it together," she whispered to herself. "There's nothing there." But the sound grew louder. Finally, unable to take it anymore, Claire pulled over, her tires skidding on the gravel shoulder. She turned on the dome light and twisted around to check the back seat. It was empty. Relief flooded through her, but it was short-lived. As she turned back to face the road, she saw it, a smudge on the rear window, faint but unmistakable. A handprint. Her stomach churned. She had checked the back seat. She knew she was alone. Claire slammed the car into gear and sped off, her pulse racing. The handprint remained, a silent reminder that something, or someone, was with her. The temperature in the car dropped steadily as she drove. Her breath fogged the windshield, and the pale patch on her arm had spread to her shoulder. It didn't hurt, but it felt wrong, as though the skin no longer belonged to her. Up ahead, a gas station appeared, its flickering neon sign a beacon in the darkness. Relief surged through Claire. She pulled in, the car lurching to a stop. The station was nearly deserted, the windows dark. A lone attendant stood behind the counter, his face partially hidden by shadows. Claire stumbled inside, desperate for some kind of human connection. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. I think someone's following me." The man didn't respond right away. He just stared at her, his eyes narrowing as they fell on her arm. "You've been touched," he said finally, his voice low. "What?" Claire followed his gaze. The pale, translucent skin now covered her entire arm, the veins beneath black and spidering outward. "They don't let go," the man continued, his voice filled with quiet dread. "Once they touch you, they're part of you." Claire's head spun. She stumbled backward, her stomach twisting. "What are you talking about? Who are they?" The man didn't answer. He just shook his head. Panicking, Claire ran back to her car. She didn't care what the man meant. She just wanted to leave. She floored the gas pedal, the engine roaring as she sped back onto the empty road. Y'all, the cold grew unbearable now, seeping into her chest, her legs, her fingertips. Her reflection in the mirror looked off. Her skin was too pale, her eyes too dark. And then she felt it again, a hand on her shoulder. This time, Claire didn't scream. She didn't even turn around. She just drove, the hand's grip tightening as the frost spread through her veins. By morning, her car was found abandoned at the side of the road, the driver's seat empty. The doors were locked, the keys still in the ignition. And on the windows, faint and overlapping, were dozens of handprints.